overall story of Jesus is a story of one person speaking powerfully about love and justice and tearing down inequality between people and creating a movement. It's also a story of someone who spoke powerfully about his love of and faith in God. The story of Jesus was not, for at least the first 1,000 years, about his death. Certainly wasn't about him dying to save us, save humanity, as is spoken so much in Christianity of today. For a long time, the part of the story about Jesus' death that was important to Christians was simply this idea of living after death or some sort of resurrection, whether that was understood literally or metaphorically. And I'll admit that certainly when I was younger, and even to some degree now, the idea of resurrection or even the afterlife wasn't that personally meaningful to me. How about you? Has anyone else struggled with that, just sort of feeling like, meh? I know that this is not true for everybody, and it's probably in part because I grew up Unitarian Universalist, and the afterlife isn't a particularly important part of our religious tradition. The message from my upbringing is that the only thing that's clearly true is that none of us can actually know what happens after we die. Maybe I have sort of felt meh in my life because it's clear to me how much matters in this life and how much focus there is to give to our day-to-day living and all of the joy and trouble that exists before we die. But also, I think for me, in part, I hadn't experienced much death in my life as a child. I'd never seen someone die. I didn't really have anyone very close to me die, except for my beloved cat and my grandparents who lived far away. My curiosity about what happens after death came alive maybe for the first time when my own father died when I was 25. He was the first person who was really close to me who had died in my life. And now, when loved ones die, or when I spend time with you all, when you might be facing the death of a loved one or your own death in your lives, the question comes alive for me again. They say that grief is the cost of love, and that the experience of grief gives shape and meaning to our lives just as much as love does. In deep grief, it's common for us to wonder what comes next. And I don't really feel like I have to know what comes next, whether it's simply an end to consciousness as my body eventually makes it back into the cycles of carbon and oxygen and hydrogen and everything else on our planet, or if there is some kind of afterlife, if there is some kind of continuation of consciousness for us, maybe a place we go where we can be reunited with those we love. That hasn't been the most important question for me, or at least I haven't really needed to know the answer. But the question has been alive for me again, or the imagining of what happens after death has been alive for me again recently. And so I want to tell just two stories. It's been alive because Al, who is a beloved family friend and self-labeled atheist, Unitarian Universalist, someone who was a survivor of juvenile diabetes and several organ transplants and car accidents and multiple cardiac arrests and more, entered the ICU early on in my sabbatical, so in late January. Al has been probably the closest person to a second father to me. His wife, Diane, and my mother were best friends since they were children. They'd all known each other and been close since childhood. So we prepared for Al's death. We have prepared for Al's death many times over my lifetime because of all of the medical challenges he faced. And we prepared for his death again several times over the nearly 2 months that he was in the ICU. And then we would breathe a sigh of relief as he kept holding on and getting stronger. But as we all know, even the most resilient bodies at some point meet their end. And so near the end of my sabbatical, when Al and his medical team and his family came to the conclusion that it wasn't possible for him to recover from this particular constellation of medical challenges he was facing, he gathered his family and friends around him one more time. And then when he was ready, he stopped the continuous dialysis that was keeping him alive. And Al died a few weeks ago. Al shared openly with anyone who was interested that he wasn't very interested in this question about what happens after death either. But his wife Diane told me that near the end of his life, maybe the last week of his life, he had a dream about heaven. And in heaven, he was just surrounded by children. And when he told this dream, not that he believed in this as afterlife, but it was just a dream, just an imagining for him. When he said this to some of his family members, his sister said, "Al, that's some people's idea of hell." And I was like, no, it's not just any children, it's my grandchildren. The shared laughter in these moments when we face death, the joy of being together, even to joke about what heaven and hell might be for each one of us, the gratitude for a life well lived that might have been so much shorter. All of these are as meaningful as the steady flow of tears that come with the death of someone we love dearly. They're as meaningful as that feeling of being completely stunned even when you knew it was coming. So the question's been on my mind because of Al. And the question's been on my mind because of Jessica. Just before Christmas in 2021, so Christmas a little over a year ago, my friend Jessica lost her 5-day-old baby. It was a medical fluke the doctors have said is equivalent to being struck by lightning. And so Kai, my partner Kai, and my child Nova and I drove up to be with her as soon as we could after her child died. And Jessica and I wept and we wailed and wondered how the world could be so cruel. And we marked her short life with a ritual at Walden Pond near where she lives up in the Boston area. And we blessed her tiny body at the crematorium before she became light and warmth and ash. When an unbelievable tragedy like this happens, it's not unusual to wonder what the meaning could be or what might come next for this little life. And so when we celebrated Penelope, her daughter's too short life last February, many of us invoked our own loved ones who had died in our words to Jessica. Kai and I sang Kermit the Frog's The Rainbow Connection at her service. And we spoke of the comfort that came when we imagined my father singing that song to her tiny and beautiful baby girl somewhere in some beautiful afterlife that may or may not exist. We talked about the love that our shared beloved teacher, Dr. Ibrahim Farajage, who's 6'7" and a huge man, might be giving to her in this imagined maybe afterlife as he held her tiny body in his giant hands. And we found time to laugh, and we found a lot of time to cry. Every year when Easter rolls around, I wonder if the importance of this theme of life after death to the people who were Jesus' immediate followers, and maybe even for the 1,000 years, almost 2,000 years afterwards, if the importance of these questions of life after death in the centrality of their faith tradition came about because of the completely natural and logical experience of being around so much death. Life expectancy was very low in Jesus' time, and really until about 1900 or later. People died mostly in their early 30s. That was the average life expectancy in Jesus' time. Maybe more infant and childhood mortality was very high. There's estimates that only maybe half of children would make it to their 10th birthday until, that was the rate until about 1900, half of children. And on top of that, death and death rituals often took place in the home back then, whereas they often take place in hospitals or funeral homes now. Doctors would come to the home to be with sick people rather than sick people going to the hospital. Death would often happen in someone's home. Bodies were washed and prepared for burial by their families in their homes. Traditions like what we call a wake now, where the body was laid out, would often happen in the deceased person's home. And loved ones would come and mourn and pay their respects before burial. Death was so much of a part of daily life for people back then, and really up until about 100 years ago. And so it doesn't surprise me that meaning-making for people back then had a lot to do with these questions of what happens after death, these questions that come up so poignantly for so many of us when we're facing death in our lives. The way that death happens now is really a blip on the radar, both in terms of location and history. And not all things about the way death happens now are necessarily good. But we are grateful for so many medical advances that mean that life expectancy is now double or more than what it was back then. We're so grateful that by 1950, global childhood mortality had gone from 50% to 27%, and now it's something like 4% around the world. Death for many of us is highly medicalized now. It happens far from our daily lives in closed rooms that we often are not in. So while I think that many of us wonder what happens after death when someone close to us dies or when we face our own death, this deep yearning for something meaningful to come after death may not feel as urgent or important to all of us every day. And so I ask myself when Easter comes around, what does resurrection mean then for us? Is it something that's kind of meh, we don't care, or is it something that has meaning for us anyway? And where I landed this year is that resurrection speaks to the power not necessarily of the afterlife, but to the cycles of life, birth and life and death that take place around us at all times and in our own lives. The Christian tradition doesn't speak about a long, unbroken line of immortality. It speaks to a cycle. And as Al's family shares pictures of him as a baby and as a child and as a young man, I see his face in the faces of his children and his grandchildren. And when I think about the ways that Al lives on after his death, knowing that he was an atheist and he didn't believe in any kind of supernatural power of prayer, I think about my understanding of prayer that I shared with him, which is that prayer has the power to change the one who prays, the prayer, the one who lifts the prayer. And so when I pray for Al, I bring to attention everything that I loved about him, everything I was grateful for in his life. And I commit myself anew to the practice of becoming more like him, Because I have power to change my own way of being in this world, and I have power to become more loving like he was. And so I pray for Al to be resurrected in me, in my way of living in this life. And I pray for that every time we have a memorial service here. We talk about the ways that what was good and wonderful about the person we've lost can live on in us as we go forward. And in the middle of my sabbatical, I got another late night call from my dear friend, Jessica. She was nearing the end of her second pregnancy. That second pregnancy which she entered into in the midst of so much grief and so much fear following the death of her beloved Penelope. And Jessica told me that she was once more being admitted to the hospital for preeclampsia, that they would begin to induce her that night or the next morning. I'll be on the next flight up, I said. And I made it to her hospital room about 12 hours into her labor. And in that place of fear, that place of remembrance for Jessica, we laid out a chalice and Penelope's photo on her bedside table. And I took the scented anointing balm that I had used to anoint Jessica before her ordination, this balm that I had used to anoint her tear-stained face as we stood next to Walden Pond to mark her daughter's death, this balm that we used to mark her daughter's body. And I anointed Jessica once again. And when the doctors told Jessica that she was ready to begin pushing, she asked me to pray. And I didn't know what to say. But as is true for all of us, we try anyway, right? So I spoke a blessing upon her body. I spoke a blessing upon the hands of the medical staff, the nurses and doctors who would be caring for her, a blessing upon this new baby getting ready to enter the world, a blessing for all of the loved ones that were lost, and a hope that Jessica and her new child would come through this birth healthy and safe and with minimal pain so that they might begin a wonderful life together. And I don't know if I believe in the supernatural power of prayer to change anything about the world other than the choices that I make myself. But we did rejoice as Jessica's new baby girl, Eleanor, came into the world. And I rejoice every day that Jessica's body has recovered well from birth, that Eleanor continues to get stronger and more resilient, and her cheeks are really plumping up very well. I don't believe that baby Eleanor is baby Penelope resurrected. I don't believe that the grief at losing a beloved child or any beloved is erased by the arrival of a new beloved. We, all of us, know that real life never guarantees a happy ending. And even a happy ending does not negate the pain that came before or the pain that lives alongside our joy. What I do know is that life is precious, my friends. Life is worth celebrating in all of its forms, including celebrating once it's gone. And what I know is that whether the Christian story is a story that is dear to you or not, whether resurrection and life after death are live questions for you, or whether you're in a meh place about them, the promise spoken of by this story is one that is still true for us all, that the cycles of life are in constant motion, that there is birth, that there is life, that there is death. And we need simply look to the tulips rising up from the ground through dead leaves to remember that we are constantly in the midst of all three of these. This story speaks to us that the joy of birth and new love and new possibility never comes without the shadow of grief and loss, that grief and loss exist alongside powerful love, which is the reason for their pain. And this story tells us that death is never the end of the story, that life continues on, and that, in fact, life is inseparable from death. It tells us that even when we come to die, whether there is an afterlife full of loved ones or a simple end to our consciousness, each one of us is carried forward in this world through the impact that we have on each other. And so, like Al did for me when I was a child, if we make space for someone to be their full selves at an insecure moment in life, they will learn how to make space for others to become their full selves later on in their lives. When we speak up for justice, when we find that we empower others to join the movement for justice as well, and the world becomes more fair and more sustainable and more liberatory. When we live life with the kind of zest that my friend Al did, the kind of person, when we live life as the kind of person whose joy at life is not dimmed by the uncertainty surrounding our future, when we live the kind of life where we're the first person on the dance floor like Al was, we invite others to live their lives fully as well, no matter what uncertainties hang over their heads. We can't experience the highs of life without also touching the lows. We can't experience the new life of spring without the death of winter. Even in the midst of death, we are in life. Even in the midst of joy, we are touched by sorrow. And so, my friends, may each of us experience the movement of life today. May we be made better by those who come before. May the lives we lead imprint love on those who will follow us. Happy Easter, and amen.
Hi, I'm Reverend Hannah Capaldi.
And I'm Reverend Abby Tennis. We are the ministers at the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, where our mission is to awaken love and justice in our lives and in the world.
We're so grateful that you watched, and we hope that the sermon connected with your soul.
We also want to invite you to join us for a live worship service every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can always find the link to that service on our website at www.philauu.org. In these services, you'll hear words like you've just heard, and you also get a chance to greet one another, pray together, sing together, and we even hold a virtual coffee hour after services to get a chance to greet some new and old friends.
If you want to support the mission of this community and you feel moved to give, you can do so by going to the website that Reverend Abby just mentioned. You can find that link below, or you can text 215-709-5095 and follow the prompts to give.
If someone in your life needs to hear these words today, we encourage you to share this video. And again, thank you so much for watching.
We hope to see you soon.